My father left for bread in childhood, and my girlfriend left me for a wealthy, real man, but I took revenge on them by creating my own business and improving myself. Growing up, I never had much, but I had my mom, and for a long time, that was enough. We lived in a small, rundown apartment in a rough part of town, the kind of place where you learn to keep your head down and mind your own business. My dad was never in the picture. I never knew if he walked out or if my mom kicked him out, and honestly, I never asked. All I knew was that she worked long hours at a local diner, doing everything she could to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. We never had extra money, never took vacations, never had the nice things other kids at school had, but we got by. From as early as I can remember, I was obsessed with cars. I couldn't explain why, but they fascinated me. I'd sit for hours on the sidewalk, watching cars pass by, memorizing the makes and models, pointing out small details that most people never noticed. When I was about 10, my Uncle Mason, my mom's older brother, gave me a chance to be around cars in a real way. He owned a small auto repair shop on the other side of town, nothing fancy, but a steady business. He let me come by after school and help out. Not with anything major at first, just sweeping floors and fetching tools. But I didn't care. Just being around the work, watching him and his guys fix up broken-down cars, made me feel like I belonged. It didn't take long before I started paying attention to everything they did. I memorized the names of parts, the sounds different engines made, the way oil smelled when it burned versus when it leaked. By the time I was 12, my uncle saw that I wasn't just another kid hanging around to pass the time. I wanted to learn. So, he started letting me get my hands dirty. At first, it was small things like changing oil or swapping out filters, but eventually, I worked my way up to bigger repairs. It turned out I had a real talent for it. Cars just made sense to me in a way that nothing else ever had. School didn't interest me much. I never saw the point of sitting in class learning things I knew I'd never use. But working in my uncle's shop? That was different. That was real. By the time I was 15, I was handling full repairs on my own. People who had been going to my uncle for years started asking for me by name. They trusted my work even though I was just a kid. It gave me a kind of confidence I'd never felt before. I knew that if I stuck with it, I could turn this into something real. I didn't just want to fix cars. I wanted to own my own shop one day. I had it all planned out in my head. I'd save up, learn everything I could, and eventually, I'd open my own place. A real business, something that was mine. It was more than a dream. It was the only thing that kept me going. While other kids my age were getting into trouble, skipping school, or wasting time, I was under the hood of a car, covered in grease, figuring out how to turn my passion into a future. After finishing high school, I enrolled in a local technical school to get my certification in auto mechanics. I already knew how to fix cars, but I figured having something official under my belt couldn't hurt. The school was nothing fancy, just a small program with a bunch of guys who, like me, weren't the type to sit in a traditional classroom for 4 more years. I didn't mind it, though. It gave me more time to work, and I was still helping out at my uncle's shop whenever I could. That's where I met Sarah. She wasn't like anyone else I had ever known. Most of the girls I grew up around didn't have time for guys like me, and I didn't blame them. I wasn't exactly anyone's idea of a perfect catch, just some guy who spent his days covered in grease, working his way toward a dream most people didn't think would ever happen. But Sarah was different. She came from money, the kind of money that let her drive around in a brand new BMW her father had bought her for her birthday. The first time I saw her, she had pulled into the school parking lot like she didn't have a care in the world, stepping out of that car like she belonged to a different reality. We met by accident. She had an issue with her car. Nothing major, just a problem with the brakes that had been bothering her. She mentioned it in passing to one of her friends, and I, being me, offered to take a look. I could tell she was skeptical at first, probably wondering why some guy in work boots and an old hoodie thought he could help. But after I explained what was wrong within minutes of looking at it, she seemed impressed. I fixed it for her right there in the parking lot, not expecting anything in return. She thanked me, then asked me how I knew so much. When I told her about my time at my uncle's shop and my plans to open my own business, she actually seemed interested. That was the beginning. She started coming around more, asking questions, pretending she needed help with small things on her car, just to have an excuse to talk. At first, I thought she was just being polite, maybe amused by the idea of talking to someone so different from the guy she was used to. But then she started opening up to me. She wasn't as happy as she looked. Her life, as perfect as it seemed from the outside, was controlled by her parents. Every decision, every move, had to be approved by them. Being with me was the first time she felt like she was doing something for herself. I fell hard. It wasn't just that she was beautiful, though she was, in a way that didn't seem real to me. It was the way she looked at me, like I was someone worth knowing, worth loving. She believed in me when so many others didn't. She listened when I talked about my dreams, and instead of laughing them off, she told me I could do it. Her family, though, made it clear that they didn't approve. The first time I met them, I saw it in their faces, the way her mother forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the way her father barely acknowledged me. I was just some mechanic's nephew from the wrong part of town, and they didn't think I was worth their time. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. I was used to people underestimating me. As long as Sarah and I were happy, I could handle whatever judgment came my way. What I didn't realize was that some things, no matter how much you ignore them, don't just go away. Over the next few years, things started to fall into place. I worked harder than ever, taking on any job I could, building a name for myself in the Detroit automotive scene. At first, it was just word of mouth. People who had come to my uncle's shop telling their friends about the kid who could fix anything. But soon, bigger opportunities started coming my way. Guys with classic muscle cars, custom imports, and high-performance vehicles began seeking me out, trusting me with their prized possessions. I had a natural feel for cars, something that couldn't be taught in any classroom. I didn't just fix them, I understood them. Every engine had a rhythm, every part had a purpose, and I knew how to bring out the best in them. The more I worked, the more my reputation grew. I started getting invited to car meets, then to exclusive garages where serious collectors brought their vehicles. People twice my age, with decades of experience in the industry, were asking for my advice. It was surreal, but I never let it get to my head. I wasn't in this for fame or recognition. I had one goal: to open my own shop and make something of myself. I had been saving every dollar I could, putting aside whatever money I didn't need for rent or tools. I wanted to do this the right way, without taking out massive loans or getting myself in debt. It wasn't easy, but I knew that every late night, every extra shift, every sacrifice was bringing me one step closer to my dream. I had already started looking at potential locations, trying to find a place where I could set up my own dealership and repair shop, a place that would have my name on it. Through it all, Sarah was there, supporting me in a way I had never experienced before. She was my biggest cheerleader, always telling me that I was going to make it, that one day people would look back and say they knew me before I was famous. We talked about the future constantly, how one day we'd leave behind all the pressure from her family, how we'd build a life together on our own terms. I knew I wanted to marry her. It wasn't even a question in my mind. She had been with me through everything, never doubting me, never treating me like I was less than anyone else. I had already started planning how I would propose. I wasn't the type to do something flashy or dramatic, but I wanted it to be special. I had saved up for a ring, something elegant but not over the top, something that would show her how serious I was. I was so focused on the future, so sure that we were on the same page, that I never stopped to think about the possibility that things might not go the way I imagined. I believed that love was enough, that hard work could fix anything. I didn't see the warning signs, the small shifts in Sarah's behavior, the way she hesitated when we talked about what was next. I had spent my whole life proving people wrong, fighting to make something of myself, and I thought that if I just kept pushing forward, everything would fall into place. But life doesn't work like that. Sarah had been trying to get me to come to one of her family's events for a while, but I always found an excuse to avoid it. I knew I didn't belong in her world, and I wasn't in any hurry to be reminded of it. But this time, she insisted. It was a charity gala, something her parents hosted every year, and she wanted me to be there with her. She said it would mean a lot, that it was time for her family to see how serious we were. I could tell she really wanted me to go, so against my better judgment, I agreed. The moment I stepped into that ballroom, I knew I had made a mistake. Everything about the place screamed wealth: crystal chandeliers, marble floors, servers in white gloves carrying around trays of champagne. It wasn't just the setting that made me uncomfortable, it was the people. They all had that polished, effortless arrogance that only comes from growing up never having to worry about money. I felt their eyes on me as soon as we walked in. I wasn't dressed badly. I had borrowed a suit from a friend, made sure I looked presentable, but it didn't matter. They could tell I didn't belong. It was in the way they barely acknowledged me, the way their polite smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. Then I met James. James was everything I wasn't. His father owned one of the biggest luxury car dealerships in the state, and he had been born into success. He was tall, confident, and had the kind of charm that came from knowing he had never had to struggle a day in his life. The moment he saw Sarah, he lit up like he had been waiting for her all night. And her parents? They practically beamed when he walked over. I stood there, watching the way he spoke to her, the way he made her laugh like I wasn't even standing next to her. He slipped into the conversation so smoothly, talking about the latest luxury cars, the exclusive brands his family worked with, the kind of future that was practically handed to him on a silver platter. I had spent years building my reputation from nothing, working my way up one job at a time, And here was this guy who had everything I wanted without ever having to fight for it. Sarah's parents made no effort to hide what they were doing. They steered every conversation toward James, praising his family, his success, his potential. They didn't even try to be subtle about it. It was humiliating. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it didn't matter, that Sarah and I were stronger than this. But then I saw something that hit me harder than anything her parents could have said. I saw doubt in her eyes. She didn't pull away when James leaned in to talk to her. She didn't push back when her parents kept suggesting how much they admired him. She just stood there, caught between the life she had always known and the future we had talked about building together. For the first time, I wondered if she was starting to realize how different we really were. I don't know why I thought Sarah and I could survive in two completely different worlds. Maybe I believed that love was enough, that everything we had been through meant something more than just a fleeting moment in her life. But I was wrong. It happened one evening, a few weeks after that humiliating charity event. She asked to meet me at a quiet cafe, the kind of place where people broke bad news. I knew something was off the moment I saw her. She wouldn't meet my eyes, and her hands fidgeted with the napkin on the table. Then she said it. She told me she couldn't do it anymore, that she needed a real man who could provide for her life, someone who could give her the security she deserved. She didn't even try to soften the blow, didn't pretend that it was about anything other than money and status. The girl who once told me she believed in me was now looking at me like I was a mistake she had to correct. I sat there in stunned silence, replaying every conversation we had ever had, every moment I thought we had shared. I wanted to ask her if it had all been a lie, if she had ever really seen a future with me, but I already knew the answer. She got up, placed a delicate hand on my shoulder as if that would make it easier, and walked out of my life. I wish I could say I picked myself up and moved on, that I threw myself into my work and proved her wrong. But that's not what happened. At first, I told myself I was fine, that she hadn't broken me. I kept working, kept pushing forward, but something inside me had cracked. The stress, the humiliation, the way she had so easily discarded me. It all started eating away at me. I stopped sleeping, started drinking more than I should, and worst of all, I started making mistakes. Word travels fast in my line of work, and my reputation, the one I had spent years building, started to slip. Clients who once trusted me with their cars began taking their business elsewhere. The high-end garages that once invited me to work with them stopped calling. I told myself it was just a rough patch, that I could turn things around, but the truth was, I was drowning. Then I made the worst mistake of all. In a desperate attempt to hold on to something, I dipped into my savings, thinking I could fix everything if I just invested in the right opportunity. But I wasn't thinking clearly, and I made the wrong choices. Before I knew it, the money I had worked so hard to save for my own shop was gone. The final blow came when my uncle, the man who had given me my first real chance, had to let me go. He didn't want to, but I had been screwing up too much, and he couldn't afford to keep me around. I didn't blame him. With no job, no money, and nothing left to show for the years I had spent trying to build a future, I had no choice but to move back in with my mother. The woman who had worked herself to the bone to give me a chance now had to take me back under her roof like I was a lost kid who had never grown up. I had spent my whole life trying to prove that I was more than where I came from, that I could rise above it. And yet, there I was, right back where I started, with nothing but regrets and the bitter taste of failure. The months that followed were some of the hardest I had ever endured. I took whatever jobs I could find, scraping by with low-paying work that barely covered my own expenses, let alone allowed me to help my mother. I spent long hours in warehouses, lifting heavy boxes in silence, working at a mechanic shop that wouldn't even let me do real repairs, just sweeping floors and taking out the trash. Eventually, I found myself working as a valet at an upscale restaurant downtown, parking cars for men who had everything I had once dreamed of. Every night, I stood outside in the cold, watching these men step out of their luxury vehicles, adjusting their expensive suits, walking into a world where success had been handed to them from birth. I tried not to think about what my life had become, but every set of keys I caught, every polished car I parked, felt like a reminder of everything I had lost. Then came the night that changed everything. As I stood outside the restaurant, waiting for the next car to pull up, I saw it, a sleek black Porsche 911 gliding toward me with effortless ease. Even before the window rolled down, I knew who it belonged to. When the door opened, James stepped out, barely glancing at me as he tossed me the keys like I was nothing more than part of the scenery. I caught them, forcing my face to remain blank, just wanting to get it over with. But then he did something that made my blood turn to ice. Without even really looking at me, he reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and held it between two fingers before smirking and saying, "Here, buy yourself something nice." It wasn't the money that got to me. I had taken tips from wealthy customers every night since I started this job. It was the way he said it, the way he barely acknowledged my existence, the way he spoke as if he were doing a favor for someone beneath him. He didn't even recognize me. After everything, after Sarah, after her family, after all the times we had been in the same room, he had already forgotten me. I took the bill without a word, got into his car, and gripped the wheel so tightly that my hands ached. I could feel the power beneath me, the kind of precision engineering I used to work on, the kind of machine I once dreamed of owning, and now I was nothing more than the guy who parked it. I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror, taking in the exhaustion in my own eyes, the weight of failure settling in my chest, and I knew in that moment that I couldn't keep living like this. That night, when my shift ended, I didn't go home. Instead, I drove straight to my uncle's shop, knowing it would be locked up for the night, but still having my old key. The place was dark, empty, silent, but the familiar scent of oil, rubber, and metal hit me the second I stepped inside. I walked to the back where the workbench stood, running my fingers along the worn surface, thinking about all the late nights I had spent here, all the cars I had fixed, all the dreams I had once had before I let everything slip away. I thought about Sarah, about her parents, about James and his smug, entitled face, and then I thought about the person I used to be before I let the world convince me I wasn't enough. I wasn't going to let them be right about me. I had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, and built too much to let it all go to waste because I had fallen into the trap of believing I wasn't worthy of success. I had been so busy feeling sorry for myself that I had forgotten what I was capable of. I wasn't meant to be a valet, or a warehouse worker, or a failure drowning in self-pity. I was meant to build something, to create something, to prove that I was more than just a mechanic's nephew from the wrong side of town. The next morning, I walked into my job, handed in my resignation without a second thought, and walked away without looking back. For the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again. Waking up the morning after quitting my job felt different, as if a weight I had been carrying for too long had finally lifted. I wasn't sure what my next step would be, but I knew I couldn't keep wasting my life, waiting for things to change on their own. If I wanted my future back, I had to take it into my own hands. The first thing I did was get my body and mind back in order. I forced myself into a strict routine, waking up early, running every morning until my lungs burned, pushing my body past the limits I had let weaken over the past year. I started reading books on business, something I had never bothered with before, studying the mechanics of running a company, handling finances, and building something sustainable. Every night, I mapped out plans for my own shop, going over locations, potential costs, and ways to get the startup money I needed. I refused to let doubt creep back in. Every time exhaustion or frustration tried to pull me down, I reminded myself that I had already hit rock bottom. The only way left to go was up. One afternoon, while walking through the industrial district, I noticed a vacant building with a large garage space. It was old, the paint peeling off the walls, but I could see the potential beneath the decay. This was it. This could be my shop. I checked the listing online later that night, feeling a jolt of excitement before reality came crashing down. The asking price was far beyond anything I could afford. Even if I worked nonstop for years, I wouldn't have enough to buy it outright, let alone get all the equipment I would need. For a moment, doubt crept in again, whispering that I was aiming too high, that I was setting myself up for another failure. But I wasn't that man anymore. I had been through too much to let a price tag scare me away. I didn't know how I would make it happen, but I wasn't going to give up. Then, life threw me an opportunity when I least expected it. One evening, I was helping a friend who still worked at my uncle's shop when an expensive car rolled into the lot. A Rolls-Royce Phantom, the kind of car you didn't see every day, let alone in a neighborhood like ours. The owner, a well-dressed man in his 60s, stepped out looking frustrated, complaining about a mechanical issue that had left him stranded nearby. My friend hesitated, unsure if they even had the right parts for a car like that, but I stepped forward without thinking. I asked a few quick questions, listened to the way the engine was struggling, and within minutes, I knew what was wrong. The man watched as I worked, barely speaking at first, but then he started asking me about my experience. I told him my story without sugarcoating anything, about how I had grown up in my uncle's shop, about the reputation I had built and lost, and about my plans to open my own business. By the time I finished fixing his car, he was looking at me with something I hadn't seen in a long time: respect. He reached into his wallet, but instead of pulling out cash, he handed me a business card. He told me he was always looking for people with real talent and drive, people who didn't just work on cars but understood them. If I was serious about my shop, he wanted to talk about an investment. I held the card in my hand long after he had driven away, barely believing what had just happened. For the first time in a long time, it felt like the universe was finally giving me a chance. And this time, I wasn't going to waste it. The months that followed were a blur of relentless work, planning, and execution. With the investment secured, I wasted no time in transforming my vision into reality. I purchased the vacant building I had set my sights on, renovated the space, and sourced the best equipment I could find. I hired a small but dedicated team of mechanics who shared my passion for precision and quality, and together, we built something that Detroit had never seen before, a high-end luxury car service that combined expertise, efficiency, and honesty, something the market desperately needed. Word spread fast. Car enthusiasts, collectors, and high-end vehicle owners who had grown tired of overpriced and subpar service at corporate dealerships started coming to us instead. We became known as the alternative to the flashy but careless repair shops that cared more about their profit margins than their customers. It didn't take long before we were being mentioned in the same breath as the biggest names in the industry, and one of those names just happened to be James's family-owned chain of luxury dealerships and service centers. As our reputation soared, his began to crumble. The truth about his company's poor service, overpriced repairs, and lack of real expertise started catching up to him. Customers who had once trusted his family's name now sought us out instead, and slowly but surely, his empire began to shrink. Eventually, his family was forced to sell off parts of their company just to stay afloat, but by then, their reputation was already too damaged to recover. One afternoon, in a moment of poetic irony, James himself walked into my shop, completely unaware of where he was. His Porsche had broken down, and without realizing whose business he had walked into, he handed over his keys, assuming he was just another customer. I let my team handle the repair, making sure every detail was done to perfection, and when the time came to settle the bill, I stood at the front desk as he approached, watching the realization dawn on his face. He looked at me, blinking in disbelief as he finally recognized where he was and who he was dealing with. I saw his jaw tighten as he glanced down at the invoice, an undeniably steep price for the high-quality work we had done. He had no choice but to pay, and as he handed over his credit card, I could see the humiliation in his eyes. There was nothing he could say, no smug comment, no condescending remark. He had no power here. Not long after, the final piece of the past came knocking on my door. Sarah, who had once walked away without hesitation, now stood before me, asking for a second chance. The lifestyle she had chosen, the security she had traded me for, had vanished along with James's failing business. She was no longer the girl with everything handed to her, no longer the woman who looked down at me from her pedestal. She tried to remind me of what we had, tried to convince me that we had always belonged together, but I'd barely heard a word of it. Standing beside me was Emma, the woman who had been with me through the most exciting chapter of my life. A professional race car driver with her own success, she was everything Sarah had never been. Independent, passionate, and driven by the same love for cars that I had carried since childhood. She had never cared about money, status, or appearances, only about the kind of person I was and the kind of future we could build together. I saw the realization hit Sarah the moment she looked at Emma, the moment she understood that she had lost me in a way that was permanent. There was no anger left in me, no bitterness, no desire for revenge. I had won in every way that mattered. My business was thriving, my reputation was stronger than ever, and I was surrounded by people who truly believed in me. As the years passed, I expanded my company, turning it into one of the most respected names in the world of luxury automotive service. Meanwhile, James, once the heir to an empire, had been reduced to selling used cars at a second-rate dealership, his family's fortune nothing but a fading memory. Sarah, the woman who had once thrown me away for wealth and security, was stuck in a life far from the one she had envisioned, trying to justify her choices to the world through desperate social media posts. But none of that mattered anymore. I had long since moved past the need to prove anything to them. My success was never about revenge. It was about becoming the man I had always known I could be. I had built something from nothing, relying not on connections or privilege, but on hard work, talent, and resilience. The best revenge was never about watching others fall. It was about rising so high that they became irrelevant. I had won not because they had lost, but because I had finally become the person I was always meant to be.